Phone and internet connections cut off once again in Gaza, as at least 50 people are killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Jabalia refugee camp.
With EU expansion and solutions for Serbia's tensions with Kosovo on the agenda, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen visits Belgrade.
New Yorkers flood the streets of the Big Apple for the 50th anniversary of the annual Spooktacular Parade. In war-ravaged Gaza, at least 50 people were killed in an Israeli airstrike on the Jabalia refugee camp. Survivors and volunteers can be seen searching for victims under the rubble as the airstrike leveled apartment buildings housing families. The Hamas-run health ministry has reported more than 150 wounded and dozens still under the rubble, calling the attack a heinous Israeli massacre. Israel says the strike has destroyed a Hamas command center, set up in civilian houses and an underground tunnel network, while also killing a key Hamas commander.
לאימונים לפעולת הטרור שאליה יצאו המחבלים לטבח ומעבר למרחב החוף ממנו יצאו מחבלים נוספים לטבח ב-7 באוקטובר.
Israeli tanks and armored vehicles are continuing to move steadily towards Gaza City, where the Israeli military says Hamas has a further network of tunnels used as a command and control center. As Palestinians bury their dead, there is news that a Rafah border crossing will open to allow the injured to be treated in Egypt's hospitals. This comes as a UN spokesperson expressed they are deeply alarmed at the intensity of the conflict.
The Secretary General is deeply alarmed by the intensification of the conflict between Israel and Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Gaza. This includes the expansion of operations by Israeli defense forces accompanied by intense airstrikes and the continued rocket fire into Israel from Gaza.
It's hoped the opening of the Rafah crossing will also allow more aid into Gaza. The crossing has been closed since the outbreak of fighting and was only partially open for a few days to allow entry of a limited number of aid trucks. Protesters calling for a ceasefire in Gaza interrupted U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken during a Senate hearing on Tuesday. As some stood up repeatedly yelling ceasefire now, others held signs reading no to the siege of Gaza, calling for the U.S. to stop sending funds to Israel. Many of them had their hands covered in red paint. Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin have appealed to an increasingly divided Congress for billions of dollars in military assistance to support both Israel and Ukraine.
Up to 60 Blue Stars of David have been tagged overnight on buildings in Paris. Since the Israel-Hamas war broke out on October 7, anti-Semitic acts have risen across France, with more than 800 acts recorded. French politicians are outraged, and the country's interior minister has threatened to name and shame websites that glorify terrorism and call for hatred of Jews or hatred of Israel.
C'est évidemment absolument inacceptable, donc on laisse encore quelques heures à ces plateformes pour répondre aux demandes de retrait de contenu et d'identification des auteurs de la part de la police.
In New York, Governor Kathy Hochul has announced steps to protect students on college campuses and in their communities, following a disturbing surge in anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim hate crimes.
Let me restate in the strongest of words. Every single New Yorker has a right to feel safe and to be safe as they go about their daily lives, and we must accept nothing less.
And in Spain, the Federation of Jewish Communities has raised concerns about the rise in online messages that stigmatize Jewish people as a whole.
Existe preocupación muchísima que lo que ha ocurrido en 8 días, en 9 días del conflicto, hacía años que no ocurrían en nuestro país.
The war between Israel and Hamas militants is the deadliest in years. Palestinians have reported another widespread outage of internet and phone services in Gaza. Protests in solidarity for Palestinians around the world continue.
French police shot and seriously injured a woman in a full veil after she threatened train passengers in Paris. Witnesses described scenes of panic at the Bibliothèque François Mitterrand station on the RERC as a woman shouted threats.
Une dame qui portait un voile intégral, tenait un certain nombre de propos qui étaient assez menaçants, parlant de commission d'attentats, utilisant un certain nombre de mots tels qu'ils m'ont été rapportés comme vous allez tous y passer, Allah Akbar, boum, je cite, et donc ces deux personnes ont relaté ces faits de la même façon. Encore une fois, un signalement en gare de Choisy-le-Roi à un agent compétent de la SNCF, et puis par ailleurs un appel qui a été donc transmis au numéro d'urgence de la SNCF.
Northwestern France is bracing for heavy rains and strong winds ahead of Storm Kieran. It's expected to hit northwestern France today and continue into Thursday. Violent winds of up to 150 kilometers an hour and waves of up to 10 meters are expected. Meanwhile, in New Rye, Northern Ireland has already had its dose of Kieran after a canal burst its banks overnight. The storm is on track for southern and central England. The north of the UK is still recovering from a battering of Storm Babbitt.
On a Balkan charm offensive, with EU expansion the ultimate goal, Ursula von der Leyen was in Belgrade to meet Alexander Vučić. The presidents of the EU Commission and Serbia both acknowledged that a major stumbling block remains tensions between Serbia and Kosovo, and ensuring both sides abide by the Ohrid Agreement that was signed in March.
It is about the implementation of the Ohrid Agreement. This Ohrid Agreement foresees various steps, which include, for example, the recognition of documents and institutions by Serbia. And this, on the other hand, goes along with the establishment of the Association of Serb-majority municipalities. This has to be delivered by Kosovo.
Serbia's president insisted that for the agreement to work, commitments were needed by both sides, commitments he said Kosovo had failed to meet.
Mi znamo šta su naše obaveze iz dijaloga I te svoje obaveze smo spremni da ispunimo. Imali smo mi sve papire koje je samo trebalo poštovati, dakle I principe usvojene, 4 dokumenta koje se odnose na zajednicu srpskih opština. Nijedan nije primenjen.
The EU Commission President is keen to point out that if political divisions cannot be overcome, Serbia could pay a hefty economic price. She believes its GDP could double in 10 years if it works with the EU.
Division within the EU over the response to Hamas's terrorist attack in Israel threatens to impede the bloc from having any meaningful influence on the future of the region. It's also potentially damaged the EU's credibility from having a strong voice on the importance of international law and protection of civilians during armed conflict. Europe's ambiguity has been criticised by EU partners, including King Abdullah of Jordan, who says the EU sees Palestinian lives as worth less than others. EU leaders called for humanitarian pauses as opposed to a ceasefire to let humanitarian aid into Gaza. It was put forward by countries such as Germany, who didn't want to be seen to interfere with Israel's right to defend itself.
You know, I think Germany may even be more pro-Israeli in its stance and articulation of Israel's right to defend itself than the United States. And I don't think that position within Germany that commands support across the coalition is likely to change in the short to medium term, regardless of how the ground invasion progresses in Gaza and the civilian casualties and the devastation we're all now likely to see. And so that is clearly going to open up a rift within the European Council between those countries that have a slightly different position and perspective on the conflict. And that, again, I think will subtract from European legitimacy, influence.
At the UN General Assembly, 4 EU countries voted against a resolution on a ceasefire, despite the bloc having agreed a unified position a day earlier. 8 voted in favour and 15 abstained. So the question is whether this disjointed vote signals a difficulty for the EU in having any meaningful role in any future negotiations.
I think it can still have a role. It is now it has now to deal with a kind of handicap with regard to Arab countries and more globally, more generally, with many partners in the South that have lost somewhat their confidence in the European Union diplomacy. So we have to rebuild that. We have to reach out to all of them. But never forget that it was the European Union that came up with the idea of a two-state solution, the need for self-determination for the Palestinian, the support for the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people.
The EU has committed to an international peace conference to revive talks on a two-state solution. It was a demand put forward by Spain, who wanted stronger support for Palestinians in Gaza. In the meantime, the crushing war continues. Shona Murray, Euronews, Brussels.
New Yorkers launched into the Halloween spirit when the streets of the Big Apple were taken over by the 50th anniversary of the annual Spooktacular Parade. The festivities have come at a time of heightened tension in the city. Officials say they are on alert after groups of protesters clash amid conflict in the Middle East. While in Northern Ireland, more than 100,000 people visited Europe's largest four-day Halloween festival in Derry. The event included street illuminations, aerial performances, pyrotechnics and music, as well as spooks and spirits crossing over to join the festivities, bringing magic and mischief to the city streets and thrilling revelers of all ages.